Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bonson's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where today we are going to go through something that is either going to be fascinating to you, depressing to you, or infuriating. It is likely it'll be a combination of all three. But what it definitely will be, and what at the nexus of the infuriation, depression, and fascination is some very important principles and lessons for how we think about economic activity, the role of the state, the importance of incentives, and the way this whole thing works. I'm using today as an example to drive the lesson I want, the issue of broadband coming to America and the $42 billion that has been spent as a result of the endeavor, the so-called infrastructure bill passed in the Biden administration, to that one of the key components of this bill was to bring wireless technology, broadband capacity to parts of America that didn't have access. This strikes me as a wonderful objective, at least theoretically. The idea of places that lack connectivity to the internet, receiving such connectivity, and the infrastructure investment that would be required to make that possible to a broader amount of people, greater connectivity, presumably greater public safety, certainly greater access for commercial life. A lot of pros that can come in this digital age from enhanced connectivity, it being a capital and resource intensive technology. It's understandable that there may be certain pockets of the country, despite the fact that a lot of this, both cable access and broadband and wireless access, is now over 25 years old, but that there would be certain parts of the country that don't have it, strikes me as an objective that we'd want to see met. So where market forces presumably couldn't deliver, the idea is that the state would deliver. In this case, really very federally empowered component because of $42 billion of available public resources. And I want to comment today as to why a grand total of zero connectivity resources have been added in the multiple years since we have invested and allocated and utilized $42 billion. Rather than deploying and upgrading broadband networks, we've done nothing, and except for fund a lot of government agencies and bureaucracy. And I'm going to walk through exactly why that is and why this is not an outlier. This is not an example of bad governmental administration. It's an example of exactly what you get when you remove incentives and remove knowledge from a process. In other words, when you seek to go around market forces and subvert healthy, normal, organic, spontaneous market activity with the benevolent intervention of the state, armed with the redistribution of other people's money, why, lo and behold, shockingly, good things do not end up happening. The agency behind this, I want to give you a little historical context because I did not know all this until some of the research I did for this episode. There is a group called the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And that is a federal agency that was originally created by executive order under Richard Nixon in 1970 in what was then called the Office of Telecommunications Policy. So, as is not often a surprise when you say the words executive order and Richard Nixon, this didn't exactly start off with great coherence and fidelity to market principles. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter took the Office of Telecommunication Policy and put it under the Department of Commerce and officially created the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. This still had not been chartered or authorized by Congress. We're now dealing with two different executive orders, one from Richard Nixon, one from Jimmy Carter. But nevertheless, this was a fully empowered agency operating under the executive branch of government. And then in 1992, Congress did make it real. They authorized what had already been existing for 22 years under two different executive orders through the Telecommunications Authorization Act. Now Congress made this agency that, again, functions as a subset of the Department of Commerce real. So in 2021, the NTIA, this National Telecommunications and Information Administration, something you may not have known existed, but I'm sure upon hearing of its existence, you will sleep better at night, established two new offices. I'm reading directly from their website in real time. This is 6 months after Doge, after President Trump's anti-woke endeavors. This is their website currently saying that they established two new offices. One was an Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth, and the second was an Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives. So what you see is the agencies tasked with spending $42 billion of public money to ensure that there is greater rural broadband access, has adopted as one of its major initiatives minority broadband access. And I want to read word for word, created a 5G challenge in order to foster, again, quoting from their own website, in order to foster a vibrant vendor community, they aim to accelerate the adoption of open, interoperable wireless network equipment to support vendor diversity, supply chain resiliency, and national security. Presumably in that order of priority, because this is the order that they wrote it in. So I'm just reading what they wrote. To support vendor diversity, and then supply chain resiliency, sounds good. And then, that national security thing. I don't really know what to say here about the genesis of this agency, the process by which it was set up, and the kind of embedded bureaucracy that it led to now an agency that has been tasked with some significant objectives, deciding to pollute it with various racially driven initiatives that strike me as being incredibly condescending. Now, let's assume they're armed with data that tells them that there is, not for economic reasons or geographical reasons or meteorological reasons, that there is something racial that is limiting access to internet. And the federal government is tasked to clean this up. And this bill passed Congress and was appropriated $42.5 billion to make this happen. They then come out with, and I quote, a 14-step process for funding to occur. And I'm going to read this as quickly as I possibly can so I don't bore you to pieces. I'm reading it to make a point that I'm going to then close with. And this point I will close with is one of the most important things I will ever say on the Capitol Record podcast. The first thing, of course, is that to get funding, they had to issue a notice of funding opportunity and let that kind of sit for 180 days. So you can't expect people to go apply for the funding if they don't know about it. So they post a notice. Fair enough. Then states have to submit a letter of intent in response to that notice. And then number 3, they have to submit a request for a planning grant up to $5 million. Now, you're going to get a lot of applicants at $5 million or less when you got $42 billion total to spend. Step number 4 is that the NTIA is to review and approve the planning grants, but there's going to be back and forth with the states along the way. But then the planning grant doesn't get you anything. After you've gone through the first 4 steps, then the states that have survived the planning grant after submitting their letter of intent now have to submit a 5-year action plan. But before that 5-year action plan can be reviewed, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is a different federal body than the NTIA, has to publish a data map where they think the broadband subsidies are needed. The NTIA is to use step 7, these FCC maps, but only after states have been allowed to submit challenges to the FCC maps. Once those challenges have been submitted, the NTIA uses the FCC map to then make their allocation decisions based on these 5-year action plans. Once that's done, then states submit an initial proposal. So again, only a government process in step 8, after a letter of intent, after a planning grant, and after a 5-year action plan have all been submitted, can then call what is next step an initial proposal. Step 9 is NTIA is to review the proposal, but then in step 10, states submit their own maps and for where these locations ought to be that may be different than the FCC map. And there has to be a process for challenges to the state's maps from environmental groups or special interest groups or any private citizen, whatever the case may be. The NTIA is tasked to review those challenges in step 11 and improve upon where the locations will be. But then step 12, the states have to run a competitive sub-granting process. And then after that is done, step 13, submit a final proposal. And in step 14, the NTIA is to review and approve the final state proposals. I'm going to ask you all something. How many government workers from a state and federal level do you think across the FCC, the various environmental elements, the NTIA, the map making, the multiple levels are involved in all of this? Fully paid, compensated, benefits, retirement, committees, to go through 14 steps to get to what is now, after multiple years, a grand total of 0 connectivity. This is the issue. We can laugh about it. There is a link I'm going to put in the show notes to a video of someone walking through, Jon Stewart, through this process, the comedian from Comedy Central, to explain how in this particular case, their point is the Biden administration's own red tape undermined their own policy. And that is one rule, that is one interpretation, that this is just bad government at play. But another interpretation might be more Hayekian. It's certainly more Bonsenian, if you don't mind me saying so. And that is that this is the norm. This is the rule, not the exception. Because by definition, when there's no profit motive, when you are empowering to somebody this far away from what rural broadband needs may be in Kansas, that it is sitting at the hands of multiple committee desks in Washington, D.C., the proximity so far removed from skin in the game that you lose knowledge necessary for time and place decision-making. And ultimately, what Jon Stewart and others reviewing this, that the video I'm putting in our show notes has, I think, 25 million views. This has become a national story about how they were unable, out of the infrastructure bill with $40-something billion to do anything productive. And the NBC, Politico, all the usual cast of left-wing media characters are shocked. And you could borrow Irving Kristol's language to say they were mugged by reality as they've churned on this bill. But I would say this isn't just a mugging by reality. It is a revelation of the Hayekian principle around knowledge, and certainly the classical economic principle about incentive. Nobody in their right mind who is a risk taker and has a reward at play, goes through 14 processes, 4 of which are hyper redundant. No economic actor subjects themselves to that kind of lunacy to get to a desired outcome. This is embedded in the nature of things. It is a reductio ad absurdum of governmental folly. Sure. Is there an additive level of woke stuff and distraction with the kind of racially driven equity objectives as opposed to just doing their job? Sure. I don't doubt that in this case, I've selected an example that is, shall we say, extra silly or extra stupid. But the silliness and stupidity is not a byproduct of this example or them going about it the wrong way. It's fundamental, inherent to any process delegated to someone who has no skin in the game. Governmental bureaucracy that Milton Friedman warned us about 50 years ago is by definition inept, and it metastasizes, and it grows from 4 bad steps in a process to 14 steps. And these redundancies and absurdities prey on themselves, so they employ more people. They generate more follow-up work. They call for more appeals. They call for more process still, all the while doing, or the one thing, I should say, preventing the doing of the one thing that we were after, which is actually producing goods and services. People that produce goods and services are actors that have incentive. They do it best when there is knowledge, and that knowledge is dispersed broadly. It is not dispersed to Washington, D.C. It is not dispersed in executive order from Richard Nixon or Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Jimmy Carter. It's not an alphabet soup of government agencies. The reason why $42 billion has been set on fire, or I think it's $44 billion set on fire for rural broadband, is because the federal government has no business in the world trying to figure out how to go about making this happen. They can't do it. They're inept at doing it. And we've seen this now firsthand the last several years. In a time period where there's a million examples I could use. One I picked from Twitter. It was close to now 100 years ago that we built the entire Empire State Building in the Great Depression, in a period that had, shall we say, somewhat inferior technology to what we have now. And we did it like in a year. And they can't plug in the Wi-Fi in 4 years for one farm in Iowa. I mean, what in the world are we talking about here? What we're talking about is where market cooperation is greatest, is amongst actors who have incentive and knowledge. That actor is not your federal government. Thank you as always for listening to David Bonson's Capital Record. Look forward to coming back to you with another episode here in a couple of days. I want to be able to unpack at greater depth but the good, bad, and ugly of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that will be our episode here in a couple of days. Thanks again for listening to David Bonson's Capital Record.